Gold coins hit the wooden table so hard that Alara Whitmore flinched from behind the door. She was not supposed to be listening. She was not supposed to know that her own father was selling her like a horse at market. But the walls in the old manor were thin, and desperation always speaks louder than secrets. 10,000, her father Edmund said, his voice shaking with relief rather than shame. The Duke has agreed to 10,000 in gold for the marriage contract. Alara's mother, Margaret, let out a breath she must have been holding for weeks. Then we are saved. The creditors will stop coming. Alara pressed her palm against the cold door and closed her eyes. She was 22 years old, and in the space of one conversation, her entire future had been decided without a single word from her. She was not being married. She was being sold. She had heard of Duke Alastair Voss before, the way everyone in the region had heard of him. He was a man wrapped in rumors, most of them dark. Some said he had a temper that could freeze a room. Others whispered that his last betrothed had vanished from court without explanation, and no one dared ask him why. He was wealthy beyond imagination, powerful beyond question, and according to every story Alara had ever heard, utterly without warmth. And now she belonged to him. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago that she would not give her family the satisfaction of her tears, not after everything they had already taken. Instead, she walked back to her room, sat at the edge of her bed, and stared at the small chest that held everything she owned. It was not much. A few dresses, a locket from her grandmother, a worn book of poetry. It was strange to think that a chest so small could hold the sum of a life about to end and a new one about to begin. The next morning, there was no warning, no gentle preparation. A carriage arrived before the sun had fully risen, its black exterior polished so perfectly that Alara could see her own reflection in the door. Two servants in fine uniforms stepped down, neither looking at her directly, as though she were already property rather than a person. "Miss Whitmore," one of them said, his voice flat, "the Duke is expecting you." Alara turned to look at her parents one last time. Her mother offered a tight, nervous smile. Her father did not meet her eyes at all. "You will want for nothing," Edmund said quietly, as though that single sentence could erase what he had done. "The Duke is a powerful man. You will live better than we ever could give you." "I would have rather had less and kept my choice," Alara said, and for the first time in her life she saw something like guilt flicker across her father's face. It vanished as quickly as it came. The carriage ride was long, hours stretching across the countryside as the land grew wilder and the roads grew narrower. Alara watched the trees blur past the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. She thought of every terrible story she had heard about the Duke, turning them over in her mind like stones, searching for some version of the truth she could survive. When the carriage finally slowed, Alara looked out and felt her breath catch. The Voss estate rose out of the mist like something built to intimidate rather than welcome. Towering stone walls, dark windows that reflected nothing, and a courtyard so vast it swallowed the sound of the carriage wheels. This was not a home. This was a fortress. The carriage door opened, and Alara stepped out onto the gravel, her legs unsteady beneath her long traveling dress. A line of servants stood waiting, silent and still, their eyes lowered. At the top of the stone steps stood a man Alara knew instantly, without needing to be told, was the Duke himself. Alastair Voss was tall, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the pale morning light rather than reflect it. His face was sharp, controlled, unreadable, the kind of face that gave nothing away even under close study. He did not smile. He did not move to greet her. He simply watched her climb the steps toward him, his gray eyes tracking every step as though he were assessing a decision rather than meeting his future wife. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, his voice low and even. "You made good time." "I did not have much say in the schedule," Alara replied before she could stop herself. Something flickered across his face, so brief she almost missed it. It was not anger. It was closer to surprise. "No," he said quietly, "I imagine you did not." He turned without another word and walked into the manor, expecting her to follow. Alara stood frozen for a moment, startled by the strange shape of his response, before forcing her feet to move. The inside of the manor was as cold and grand as the outside, filled with portraits of stern ancestors and halls so long they seemed to stretch into shadow. A woman appeared at Alara's side, introducing herself as Nora, the housekeeper who would show her to her rooms. Nora's expression was kind but cautious, the look of someone who had learned to be careful with her opinions inside these walls. "You will find the manor quiet," Nora said as they walked. "The Duke does not care for noise or company, but do not mistake his silence for cruelty." "What should I mistake it for then?" Alara asked. Nora hesitated. "That is not for me to say, miss." Alara's new chambers were larger than her entire childhood home, filled with fine furniture and heavy curtains that blocked most of the daylight. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed and finally allowed herself one slow breath, the first real one she had taken since the carriage arrived. She was here now. There was no going back to the life she once knew, no matter how much she wished there was. That evening she was summoned to dine with the Duke, a formal affair in a dining hall far too large for two people. The table stretched endlessly between them, candles flickering in silver holders, servants moving in and out with practiced silence. Alistair sat at the head of the table, eyes fixed on his plate more than on her. "You do not have to pretend to enjoy this," he said after a long silence. "I know why you are here." Alara set down her fork, surprised by his bluntness. "Then you understand why I am not in the mood for polite conversation." "I do not require polite conversation," he said. "I require honesty. It is a rare enough thing in this house." "Then I will be honest," Alara said, lifting her chin. "I did not choose this. I did not choose you. My family sold me to solve their debts, and I am expected to smile and be grateful for it." For a moment Alistair said nothing, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she refused to. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Then we understand each other," he said, "because I did not choose this either, not in the way you think." Alara frowned, confused by the strange weight in his words, but before she could ask what he meant, he rose from the table, offered a brief nod, and left the hall without another word, leaving her alone with more questions than she had arrived with. The following days fell into a strange rhythm. Alara explored the manor cautiously, mapping its endless corridors, learning the names of the servants who treated her with a mixture of respect and pity. She rarely saw the Duke, who spent most of his hours locked away in his study or riding out across the estate alone. When their paths did cross, their conversations were short, careful, edged with a tension neither of them seemed willing to name. One afternoon, while wandering through a quiet corridor she had not yet explored, Alara paused at the sound of raised voices coming from behind a heavy oak door. She recognized the Duke's voice, low and controlled even in anger, speaking to someone she did not know. "The arrangement is not up for negotiation," Alistair said sharply. "The payment stands as agreed." "You already gave them more than they asked for," the other voice replied, clearly one of his advisors. "Why continue to indulge a family that sold their own daughter without hesitation?" There was a long pause before the Duke answered, his voice dropping so low that Alara had to lean closer to hear it at all. "Because she did not deserve the price they set for her," he said, "and I intend to make sure she never has to depend on them again." Alara stepped back from the door, her heart pounding for reasons she could not fully explain. She had expected cruelty from this man, calculation, indifference. She had not expected this, whatever this strange, guarded protectiveness was. It unsettled her more than his silence ever had, because it meant the man she thought she understood was not nearly as simple as the rumors claimed. That night, as she lay awake staring at the dark canopy above her bed, Alara found herself replaying his words over and over. She did not deserve the price they set for her. It was such a small sentence, and yet it had cracked something open inside her that she had spent weeks trying to keep sealed shut. She did not know yet what kind of man Duke Alistair Voss truly was, but she was beginning to suspect that the stories told about him were missing something important, something hidden beneath the cold walls of this fortress he called home. And whether she liked it or not, She was determined to find out exactly what that was. A second carriage arrived at the Whitmore estate less than a month after Alara had gone, and this time it did not carry a person. It carried a chest, heavy and locked, delivered by a rider who said only that it came from Duke Voss and required no reply. Edmund Whitmore's hands trembled as he broke the seal, and when the lid opened, the gleam of gold coins filled the room with a light that made his breath catch in his throat. "There must be some mistake," Margaret whispered, running her fingers over the coins as though she did not trust them to be real. "We already received the full payment." "This is more than the full payment," Edmund said, counting quickly, his voice rising with disbelief. "This is nearly double." Word of the second payment spread through the countryside faster than any of them expected, carried by servants, merchants, and travelers who could not resist repeating such a strange and lavish gesture. By the time it reached the halls of court, it had transformed into a dozen different rumors, each one wilder than the last. Some said the Duke had fallen instantly in love with his new bride. Others said it was guilt, that he had done something terrible to the Whitmore family and was trying to buy his way clear of it. A few claimed it was simply madness, that the Duke had always been unpredictable, and this was only further proof. At the Voss estate, Alara heard the rumors before she heard the truth, carried to her by Nora, who delivered the news with wide eyes and a voice full of disbelief. "He sent them more gold," Nora said, setting down a tray of tea with hands that were not quite steady. "Nearly double what was agreed. No one understands why." Alara sat very still, her fingers curling around the edge of her chair. She thought of the conversation she had overheard weeks earlier, the Duke's low voice insisting that she did not deserve the price her family had set for her. She had told herself she misunderstood, that the words meant something simpler than they seemed. But this could not be a coincidence. She found him that evening in his study, a room she had rarely entered, lined floor to ceiling with books and lit by a single lamp that cast long shadows across his sharp features. He looked up when she entered, his expression carefully composed, though something in his eyes shifted the moment he saw the look on her face. "You sent them more money," Alara said, not bothering with pleasantries. "After everything, after they sold me without a second thought, you gave them even more." Alistair set down the papers he had been reading and folded his hands on the desk. "Yes." "Why?" she demanded. "Explain it to me, because I cannot make sense of it. You did not owe them anything more." "You certainly did not owe me an explanation, and yet here I am asking for one." He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes steady on hers in a way that made it difficult to look away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate, each word chosen with care. "Because you are worth more than they priced you at," he said. "Your family valued you at 10,000 in gold, as though a person could be measured in coin. I wanted them to understand exactly how wrong they were." Alara's breath caught. "That is not an answer, that is a riddle." "It is the only answer I have," he said, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw something almost vulnerable cross his face before it disappeared behind his usual composure. "I do not expect you to understand it yet." "Then help me understand," Alara said, stepping further into the room, refusing to let him retreat into silence the way he always did. "Everyone speaks of you as though you are made of stone, Duke Voss, cold, calculating, unreadable, and yet you send my family a fortune out of what, spite? Guilt? Something else entirely. I would like to know which version of you is real, because I am the one who has to live in this house." Something in her words seemed to land differently than she expected. Alistair rose from his desk slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the dark grounds outside, his back to her for a long moment before he spoke again. "My father arranged my first betrothal when I was 19, he said quietly. "A woman named Isabel. I was told she loved me. I believed it foolishly, completely. It took me 3 years to learn that her family had negotiated the match purely for the wealth it would bring them, and that she had never cared for me at all. When the truth came out, she left without a word of apology, and I was left to explain to the entire court why my betrothal had collapsed in scandal." Alara stood very still, listening, the anger in her chest slowly giving way to something quieter. Since then, Alastair continued, I have watched families treat marriage as a transaction more times than I can count. Daughters sold for debts, sons traded for titles, love treated as an inconvenience rather than a requirement. When your father agreed to sell you for gold, I recognized the pattern instantly. I have seen it before. I did not want you to begin your life here believing that 10,000 coins was the sum of your worth. So you paid them more, Elara said slowly, to prove a point that had nothing to do with them at all. Perhaps, Alastair admitted, or perhaps I simply could not stand the thought of you believing it, even for a moment. The room fell silent, the lamp flickering between them, and Elara found herself unable to summon the anger she had walked in with. In its place was something far more complicated, a strange, unwelcome softness toward a man she had sworn to keep at a distance. That still does not make you an easy man to understand, she said finally, her voice quieter than before. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of his mouth, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. No, he agreed. I do not suppose it does. Over the following days, Elara found herself watching him more closely, searching for the cracks in his composed exterior that his explanation had revealed. She noticed things she had missed before, the way he lingered near doorways when she entered a room, as though ensuring her comfort without wanting credit for it, the way he corrected servants quietly when they spoke to her with less respect than she deserved, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she was not looking. But the estate was not without its dangers, and Elara soon learned that not everyone welcomed her presence. During a visit from a neighboring lord named Gareth Ashford, a man with an easy smile and calculating eyes, Elara felt an immediate unease she could not explain. "The bought bride," Gareth said with a smile that did not reach his eyes, cornering her near the garden entrance while the Duke was occupied elsewhere. "Tell me, does it bother you, knowing your husband paid for you the way one pays for cattle?" "It bothers me that you think insulting me is an appropriate use of your time," Elara replied evenly, refusing to let him see how deeply his words had struck. Gareth's smile widened, unbothered by her sharpness. "The Duke has a habit of collecting broken things and calling it kindness. First it was Isabel, though that ended rather badly for him, did it not? Now it is you. I wonder how long before you disappear too." Elara's blood ran cold at the implication, but before she could respond, Alastair's voice cut through the garden like a blade. "Ashford," he said, stepping into view, his expression darker than Elara had ever seen it. "You are not welcome to speak to my wife without my presence, and you will not do so again." Gareth raised his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes remained sharp with amusement. "Only making conversation, Voss, no need for hostility." "Leave," Alastair said, his voice low and final, carrying a weight that left no room for argument. Gareth's smile faltered slightly before he offered a shallow bow and departed, leaving the garden thick with unspoken tension. Alastair turned to Elara immediately, his composure cracking just enough for genuine concern to show through. "Did he harm you?" "No," Elara said, though her voice shook slightly. "But he mentioned Isabel. He said she disappeared. What did he mean by that?" Alastair's jaw tightened, his eyes shadowed with something that looked dangerously close to old pain. "That is a story for another time," he said quietly. "But I promise you, whatever Ashford implied, the truth is far different than the rumor. I would never wish harm on you." "You have my word." Elara studied him carefully, searching his face for deception and finding none, only a tired, guarded honesty that felt more convincing than any smooth denial could have been. She did not fully understand this man yet, not his past, not the shadows that clung to him, not the reasons behind his strange generosity. But standing in that garden, watching him defend her with a fierceness she had not expected, Elara realized that whatever answers she was searching for, she intended to find them, no matter how deep she had to dig. The court gathering that season was the largest Elara had ever attended, a glittering hall filled with silk gowns, polished jewelry, and voices that rose and fell like waves crashing against unseen rocks. She stood near the edge of the room, uncomfortable in the borrowed grandeur of her new position, watching as nobles she barely recognized whispered behind painted fans whenever she passed. She had grown used to being watched at the Voss estate, but this was different. Here, every glance felt like a verdict, every whisper like a blade aimed at her back. "They call her the bought bride," a woman murmured just loud enough for Alara to hear as she passed. 10,000 gold, and then double that again. One wonders what she did to earn such generosity. Alara kept her chin high and her steps steady, refusing to let the words show on her face, though they settled into her chest like stones. She had learned quickly that surviving court meant showing nothing, giving them no reaction to feed on. Across the room, she caught sight of Alistair speaking with a group of older lords, his expression composed and distant as always, though she noticed his eyes drift toward her more than once, checking, watching, as though ensuring she was still standing despite the storm around her. A young woman approached her not long after, introducing herself as Lady Beatrice, her smile warm in a way that felt almost startling after so much cold judgment. "Do not let them trouble you," Beatrice said quietly, falling into step beside Alara. "Court has little else to occupy itself with besides gossip. You will find that most of it says more about them than it ever will about you." "That is kind of you to say," Alara replied, grateful for even a small moment of genuine warmth, "though it does not make the whispering any easier to bear." "No," Beatrice agreed, "but it does help to know you are not entirely alone in it." As the evening wore on, Alara found herself drawn into conversation with several of the court's women, some genuinely curious about her, others clearly testing her for weaknesses they could later exploit. She navigated each exchange carefully, aware that a single misstep could become the next season's favorite rumor. It was exhausting in a way she had not expected, this constant performance of composure, but she refused to let it break her. Later, as the crowd thinned and the music slowed into something softer, Alara stepped out onto a balcony overlooking the torch-lit gardens, grateful for a moment of quiet away from the crush of watching eyes. She had not been alone for long when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Gareth Ashford approaching, his expression carrying none of the warmth Beatrice had offered. "You handled yourself well tonight," Gareth said, leaning against the stone railing beside her, far closer than she would have liked. "Most bought brides crumble under that kind of attention within their first season. You are proving to be more resilient than expected." "I would prefer you did not use that phrase," Alara said evenly, stepping back to put distance between them. "Apologies," Gareth said, though his tone suggested none. "Old habits. Tell me, has the Duke told you yet what truly happened to Isabel, or does he prefer to keep his new bride in the dark the way he kept the last one?" Alara's stomach tightened, but she refused to let curiosity override caution. "Whatever happened between them is not your concern, nor is it mine to discuss with you." "Careful," Gareth said softly, his voice dropping into something colder. "Loyalty is a fine trait, but blind loyalty has cost women far more than their pride before. Ask him about the night she vanished. Ask him why no one at court has seen her since, and why the story changes depending on who tells it." Before Alara could respond, a familiar voice cut sharply through the tension. "That is enough, Ashford." Alistair stood in the balcony doorway, his expression carved from stone, fury simmering just beneath the surface of his controlled voice. Gareth straightened immediately, offering a shallow, mocking bow before slipping back inside without another word, leaving the two of them alone in the torchlight. "You should not listen to him," Alistair said quietly, though his eyes carried a weight that suggested even he was not entirely certain of his own words. "Then tell me the truth yourself," Alara said, turning to face him fully. "I have heard enough half-stories and cruel implications tonight. I want to know what truly happened to Isabel, and I want to hear it from you, not from a man clearly determined to use her memory as a weapon against us both." Alistair was silent for a long moment, the torchlight flickering shadows across his sharp features, before he finally nodded, as though some internal decision had been made. "Not here," he said. "Come with me." He led her away from the noise of the gathering, through quiet corridors and out into the private gardens surrounding the court estate, until the music faded into distant memory, and only the sound of their footsteps on gravel remained. When they finally stopped beneath a wide, old tree, Alistair turned to face her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Isabel did not disappear the way Ashford implies," he said slowly. "She left, willingly and without warning, 3 days before our wedding was meant to take place. I learned afterward that her family had arranged the match purely to secure my wealth, and that she had accepted a far more lucrative offer from another suitor once it presented itself. She did not care for me, Alara. She never had. But because I refused to speak of the humiliation publicly, because I chose silence over scandal, the story twisted itself into something far darker over the years. People assumed the worst, and I allowed it, because the truth felt like a wound I was not ready to expose." Alara studied his face carefully, searching for any hint of deception, and found only the tired honesty of a man finally setting down a burden he had carried alone for far too long. "Why tell me now?" she asked softly. "Because you deserve better than rumors," he said, "and because I find that I care what you think of me far more than I expected to." The admission hung between them, quiet and fragile, and for the first time since her arrival at the estate, Alara felt the wall between them shift, just slightly, just enough to glimpse the man hidden beneath the cold reputation the court had built around him. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. Alistair nodded, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary before he seemed to catch himself, stepping back and offering his arm to escort her back toward the gathering. Alara took it, and as they walked in comfortable silence beneath the moonlit trees, she found herself thinking that perhaps the man she had been sold to was not the man the rumors described at all, but someone far more complicated, far more guarded, and far more worth knowing than she ever could have imagined on the day her family traded her away for gold. Yet even as the tension of the evening eased, a shadow lingered at the edge of Alara's thoughts. Gareth Ashford's warning had not felt like idle cruelty. It had felt like a promise, one she suspected had not yet been fulfilled, and one that would return to test them both far sooner than either of them expected. Weeks passed at the Voss estate, and slowly, without either of them fully acknowledging it, the distance between Alara and Alistair began to narrow. Small moments accumulated like drops filling a basin, each one insignificant on its own, yet together forming something neither could easily deny. He began joining her for breakfast instead of taking his meals alone in the study. She began waiting in the library in the evenings, knowing he often passed through after his work was finished, and that he rarely walked by without stopping to speak with her, even briefly. One rainy afternoon, confined indoors by a storm that rattled the windows, Alara found Alistair in the library staring at a chessboard set up near the fireplace, an old, worn set that looked as though it had not been used in years. "Do you play?" he asked without looking up. "Poorly," Alara admitted, settling into the chair across from him. "My father considered it a waste of time better spent on needlework." "Your father," Alistair said dryly, "seems to have had a great many opinions about how you should spend your time, and very few of them served you well." Alara laughed softly, surprised by the unexpected humor in his voice. "That may be the truest thing anyone has said about him." They played for over an hour, Alistair patiently explaining strategies she had never learned, his usual guarded formality softening into something almost playful as he teased her gently over her mistakes. Alara found herself laughing more in that single afternoon than she had in months, and when she finally looked up to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, warmth spread through her chest in a way that startled her with its intensity. "You seem surprised," she said quietly, "that I can laugh." "I am surprised," Alistair admitted, "at how much I have come to enjoy hearing it." The words settled between them, quiet and honest, and neither moved to break the moment that followed. It was Nora's arrival with tea that finally pulled them back into the ordinary rhythm of the day, though the warmth of that afternoon lingered long after the rain had stopped. Not every day passed so gently, however. Alara continued to feel the weight of court judgment whenever she attended gatherings, and Gareth Ashford's presence remained a persistent shadow at the edges of every event, his smile never quite reaching his eyes whenever their paths crossed. She said nothing of these encounters to Alistair, not wanting to give Ashford the satisfaction of disrupting the fragile peace she had found, but the unease never fully left her. It was during a visit to a neighboring estate for a formal dinner that the tension finally broke into something far more dangerous. Alara had stepped away from the gathering to find a quiet moment near the stables, needing space from the crowded hall, when she heard voices carrying from around the corner of the building. She recognized Gareth's voice immediately, low and urgent, speaking to someone she did not know. "The second payment proves it," Gareth was saying. "Voss is hiding something. No man pays double for a bride he does not care for unless he is trying to bury a secret beneath gold. Find out what really happened the night Isabel left. I want proof, not rumors." Alara's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall, listening despite the danger of being discovered. The other voice, gruffer and unfamiliar, answered quietly. "And if there is nothing to find?" "Then we create something," Gareth said coldly. "A man like Voss has too much power at court. It is time someone reminded him what it feels like to lose everything he values." Alara's blood ran cold as the implication settled over her. This was not simple gossip or petty rivalry. Gareth intended to manufacture a scandal, and given his earlier warnings about Isabel, Alara suspected she herself might become the easiest target for whatever plot he was building. She backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound, before hurrying back toward the safety of the crowded hall, her thoughts racing. She found Alistair near the entrance, speaking quietly with one of his advisors, and the moment he saw her expression, his own posture shifted immediately into alertness. "What happened?" he asked, stepping away from the conversation without hesitation. "Ashford," Alara said quietly, pulling him aside into a private corner. "I overheard him near the stables. He is planning something against you, some kind of scandal involving Isabel. He said if there is nothing to find, he will create something. I believe he intends to use me to do it." Alistair's expression darkened, a controlled fury settling over his features that Alara had only glimpsed once before, the night he confronted Ashford in the garden. "He would not dare act so openly without confidence in his position," Alistair said, more to himself than to her. "Which means he already believes he has something to use against us." "What could he possibly have?" Alara asked. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, before he finally answered. "Isabel did not simply vanish from court after our broken engagement. She remarried quietly to a family with ties to Ashford's own household. If he has spoken with her, if she has told him her version of events, twisted or otherwise, he could use it to fabricate a story far more damaging than the truth." "Then we need to stop him before he acts," Alara said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Alistair studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind the concern in his eyes. "We," he repeated quietly. "You do not have to involve yourself in this, Alara. This is my burden to carry." "You made my burdens your own the moment you sent that second payment," Alara said. "I will not stand aside now and pretend this does not concern me as well." For the first time since she had known him, Alistair reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and steady, grounding rather than possessive. "Then we face it together," he said quietly. "But you must promise me you will be careful. Ashford is dangerous precisely because he is patient. He will not act until he believes he cannot lose." Alara nodded, though the unease in her chest did not fully settle, a quiet certainty forming that whatever storm Gareth Ashford intended to unleash, it would arrive far sooner than either of them was fully prepared for. The storm arrived 3 nights later, though not in the form either of them expected. Alara was returning from the eastern garden path, the one she had taken to walking each evening after supper to clear her thoughts, when a hand closed suddenly over her arm and pulled her into the shadows beside the stone wall. She gasped, ready to scream, until a familiar voice hissed urgently into her ear. "Quiet," Nora whispered, her face pale in the moonlight. "You must come with me now. Something is happening." Alara followed Nora through a narrow servant's passage, her heart pounding, until they reached a small window overlooking the front courtyard. Below, torches illuminated a scene that made Alara's stomach drop. A group of unfamiliar men stood near the gate, and among them, unmistakable even at a distance, stood Gareth Ashford, speaking with quiet intensity to a woman Alara had never seen before, dressed in fine traveling clothes, her face partially hidden beneath a dark hood. "That is her," Nora whispered. "That is Isabel." Alara's breath caught. "What is she doing here?" "I do not know," Nora admitted. "But Ashford arrived not an hour ago, uninvited, demanding to speak with the Duke immediately. He would not say why." Alara did not hesitate. She hurried through the manor's halls, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination, until she found Alistair already striding toward the front entrance, his expression carved from cold fury. He paused only briefly when he saw her. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "No," Alara said, matching his pace despite his protest. "Whatever this is, it concerns me as much as it concerns you. I am not hiding while you face it alone." Something in her tone must have convinced him there was no point arguing, because he did not slow his steps, and together they reached the courtyard just as Gareth turned to face them, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Vas," Gareth said pleasantly, as though arriving uninvited in the middle of the night with an armed group and a woman from Alistair's past was the most ordinary thing in the world. "I believe you remember Isabel." Alistair's jaw tightened, though his voice remained dangerously calm. "What is the meaning of this, Ashford?" Isabel stepped forward slightly, lowering her hood to reveal a face lined with something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. "Alistair," she said quietly, "I did not want to come. He forced my hand." "Forced?" Gareth scoffed. "I merely reminded her of the debts her new husband owes me, debts that could easily be forgiven in exchange for a little cooperation. Isabel has agreed to tell the court the true story of what happened between you two, a story far more damaging than the polite silence you have maintained all these years." "There is no true story beyond what already happened," Alistair said sharply. "She left. She chose wealth over loyalty. That is the entirety of it." "Perhaps," Gareth said, his smile widening, "but the court does not need the truth, Vas. They need only a compelling story, and I intend to give them one. A tale of a duke so desperate to control the women in his life that he pays fortunes to silence them, first Isabel's family and now the Whitmores. It hardly matters if it is accurate. It only matters if it is believed." Alara felt fury rise in her chest, sharp and immediate. "You would fabricate lies to destroy a man's reputation, simply because your own ambitions were never enough to earn you power at court honestly." Gareth's eyes flicked toward her, cold amusement flickering across his face. "Ah, the bought bride finds her voice. Careful, girl. You are standing far too close to a fire you do not yet understand." "I understand it perfectly," Alara said, stepping forward despite Alistair's hand tightening protectively around her arm. "You are a man so consumed by envy that you would rather burn someone else's life to the ground than build anything worthwhile of your own. That is not power, Lord Ashford. That is cowardice wearing power's clothing." For a moment, something flickered across Gareth's composed expression. A crack in his confidence he quickly smoothed over, though not quickly enough to hide it entirely. Alistair stepped forward then, his voice low and lethal in a way Alara had never heard from him before. "You will leave my estate immediately," Alistair said, "and you will take whatever fabricated story you intended to spread and bury it, or I will ensure the court learns the truth about your own debts, the ones you conveniently forgot to mention while accusing me of financial manipulation. I have friends in far higher places than you realize, Ashford, and patience for men who threaten my household." Gareth's confidence wavered visibly, his eyes darting between Alistair's unshakable resolve and the small group of armed estate guards who had quietly gathered behind them during the confrontation, drawn by the commotion. Isabel, for her part, looked as though she wished to be anywhere else, her earlier guilt deepening into something closer to shame. "This is not finished," Gareth said finally, though the threat carried less weight than he clearly intended. "It is finished the moment you step off my land," Alastair replied evenly. "And if you return, uninvited, threatening my wife again, you will find me far less restrained than I am being tonight." Gareth held his gaze for a long, tense moment before finally turning away, gesturing sharply for his men to follow as he stormed back toward the gate. Isabel lingered a moment longer, her eyes meeting Alara's with something unreadable before she, too, turned and disappeared into the darkness beyond the estate walls. The courtyard fell into silence, broken only by the distant sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. Alara realized only then that she was trembling, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally catching up to her all at once. Alastair turned to her immediately, his hand steadying her shoulders, his expression softening from cold fury into genuine concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," Alara said, though her voice shook slightly. "Frightened perhaps, but not hurt." "You should not have come out here," he said quietly, though there was no real anger in his voice, only worry. "He could have hurt you." "And you should not have faced him alone," Alara replied. "We agreed to face this together, did we not?" Alastair studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, before he pulled her gently into an embrace, his arms wrapping around her with a careful, uncertain tenderness, as though he were still learning how to hold something he had decided was worth protecting. Alara allowed herself to lean into it, the fear of the night slowly easing beneath the steady warmth of his presence. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair, "for standing beside me tonight." "I meant what I said to him," Alara replied softly. "This is my life now too. I will not watch it be threatened without fighting for it." Alastair pulled back just enough to look at her, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You continue to surprise me," he said quietly. "Good," Alara said, a faint, tired smile finally breaking through the tension of the night. "I would hate to become predictable." Neither of them moved for a long moment, standing together beneath the moonlight in the aftermath of danger narrowly avoided. And though the threat of Gareth Ashford had not fully disappeared, something had changed between them that night, solidified in the fire of shared danger and mutual trust. Whatever storm still waited on the horizon, Alara understood now, with a certainty she had not expected to feel so soon, that she would not face it as a stranger sold into a stranger's house. She would face it as his equal, standing beside a man who had chosen, again and again, to protect what he valued most. Peace, however, proved fragile. Barely 2 weeks after the confrontation with Gareth Ashford, a letter arrived at the estate bearing the familiar, careless handwriting of Alara's father. She recognized it immediately, her stomach tightening before she had even broken the seal. Inside, Edmund's words were dressed in false affection, wrapped around a demand so bold it left her hands trembling with anger by the time she finished reading. "They want more money," Alara said, setting the letter down on the study desk where Alastair sat reviewing estate accounts. "My father claims new debts have arisen, urgent ones, and insists that given the Duke's, and I quote, generous nature, surely another modest contribution would not be missed." Alastair took the letter, his expression darkening as he read through it himself. "This is not a request," he said quietly. "This is an attempt to establish a pattern, to convince themselves that my generosity is a well they can return to indefinitely." "I am sorry," Alara said, embarrassment coloring her voice. "I never wanted you dragged into their greed a second time." "You have nothing to apologize for," Alastair said firmly, setting the letter aside. "Their choices are not a reflection of your character, Alara. You have proven that 100 times over since you arrived here." Despite his reassurance, the situation escalated faster than either of them anticipated. Within days, Edmund arrived at the estate himself, uninvited, his carriage rattling up the drive with an urgency that suggested desperation rather than mere greed. Alara watched from an upstairs window as her father climbed down, straightening his coat with the same nervous energy she remembered from the night he had first announced her sale. "He should not be here," Alara murmured, already moving toward the stairs. She reached the entrance hall just as Nora showed Edmund inside, his eyes darting around the grand foyer with poorly disguised calculation. When he saw Alara, his expression shifted into practiced warmth that did not reach his eyes. "Alara," he said, opening his arms as though expecting an embrace she had no intention of offering. "You look well. Marriage suits you." "What are you doing here?" Alara asked, keeping her distance. "Can a father not visit his daughter?" Edmund asked, feigning wounded surprise. "Not when his daughter knows him well enough to recognize what visits like this usually mean," Alara replied evenly. Before Edmund could respond, Alastair appeared at the top of the staircase, descending with slow, deliberate steps that carried an unmistakable authority. Edmund's posture straightened immediately, his charm sharpening into something more calculated as he addressed the Duke directly. "Your Grace," Edmund said, bowing slightly, "I hoped we might discuss a small matter, family to family, given the closeness our arrangement has created between our households." "There is no closeness between our households, Whitmore," Alastair said, his voice cold and precise. "There is a marriage contract, which was honored twice over, and a daughter you sold without a single thought for her well-being. That is the entirety of our relationship." Edmund's smile faltered slightly, though he pressed forward regardless. "Surely a man of your wealth would not begrudge a struggling family a small additional contribution, given the circumstances that brought Alara into your household in the first place." "The circumstances," Alastair said sharply, "were that you sold your own daughter to settle your debts, and then attempted the same tactic again the moment your funds ran short a second time. I paid the agreed sum. I paid it again out of a sense of justice that had nothing to do with rewarding your greed. There will not be a third payment." "You misunderstand my intentions," Edmund said, his composure cracking further. "I only wish to ensure my daughter's family remains provided for, as any reasonable arrangement would allow." "Alara is provided for," Alastair replied. "She is my wife under my protection in my household. Her family's debts are no longer her burden to carry, nor mine to continue funding indefinitely. If you require further assistance, I suggest you seek employment or manage your finances with greater responsibility, rather than treating your daughter's marriage as a renewable source of income." Edmund's face reddened, humiliation and anger warring behind his eyes. "You would speak to me this way, after everything I have done to secure her future." "You secured nothing but your own comfort," Alastair said, his voice dropping into something colder and more final. "And you will not use my household to continue funding your poor decisions. This conversation is finished." For a long moment, Edmund looked as though he might argue further, his mouth opening around some fresh justification, but the resolute silence radiating from both Alastair and Alara left no room for negotiation. Finally, with a stiff, humiliated bow, he turned and left the manor, his carriage disappearing down the drive far faster than it had arrived. Alara stood in the quiet aftermath, an unexpected weight lifting from her shoulders that she had not fully realized she was carrying. For the first time since her family had sold her, she felt truly free of their grasp, no longer a resource to be exploited, but a person whose worth had finally been recognized and defended. "Thank you," she said quietly, turning to Alastair. "You do not need to thank me for refusing to let someone exploit you," he said gently. "You are not a debt to be collected, Alara. You never were." Alara felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, a quiet certainty forming that had been building slowly since the night in the courtyard, since the chess games in the library, since every small, careful act of protection he had offered without ever demanding recognition for it. She was beginning to understand, with growing clarity, that whatever this arrangement had started as, it had become something else entirely, something she was no longer certain she wanted to end. That evening, as the sun set over the estate grounds in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Alara found Alastair standing alone on the terrace, watching the horizon in quiet contemplation. She joined him without a word, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You defended me today," she said softly, "the way you have defended me since the moment I arrived here. I do not think I ever properly thanked you for that, not truly." You do not owe me thanks, Alistair said, glancing sideways at her. I have only done what any decent person would do. No, Alara said, shaking her head. Not everyone would have done what you did. Most men in your position would have taken the easier path, the colder path. You chose otherwise again and again, even when it cost you nothing to simply look away. Alistair turned to face her fully then, something vulnerable flickering behind his usual composure. I told you once that I recognized the pattern in your family's actions because I had seen it before. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. Then tell me the rest, Alara said quietly. The rest, Alistair said slowly, is that from the moment you stepped out of that carriage, frightened and furious and refusing to hide either emotion from me, I could not stop thinking of you as anything other than remarkable. I told myself it was simple respect, admiration for your resilience. But it became something far more than that, far sooner than I intended to admit, even to myself. Alara's breath caught, her heart pounding as she studied the sincerity written plainly across his face for the first time since they had met. Alistair, she said softly, what are you saying? I am saying, he replied, reaching for her hand with careful, deliberate tenderness, that this began as an arrangement neither of us chose, built on gold and desperation and circumstances outside our control. But somewhere between the chess games and the courtyard and every quiet moment since, it stopped feeling like an arrangement to me entirely. The words hung between them, fragile and honest, and Alara found herself unable to look away from the raw vulnerability in his eyes, a vulnerability she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to witness. Whatever uncertainty had lingered in her heart since the day her family sold her away, it dissolved entirely in that quiet moment on the terrace, replaced by a warmth she had never expected to find in the fortress she once feared. Word of Edmund's humiliating dismissal from the Voss estate reached the court within days, twisted and reshaped by eager tongues into a story that painted Alara sympathetically for the first time since her arrival. Where once the whispers had mocked her as the bought bride, they now murmured admiration for the Duke's fierce loyalty toward her, and quiet respect for a woman who had refused to be used as a tool by either her family or the ambitious men circling the court. Alara noticed the shift immediately during the next gathering she attended. The sharp glances softened into something closer to curiosity, and even a few genuine smiles from women who had previously refused to acknowledge her at all. Yet even as her standing at court improved, Gareth Ashford's presence remained a persistent threat lurking at the edges of every event, his humiliation from the courtyard confrontation clearly unforgotten. Alara noticed him watching her from across crowded halls, his expression unreadable, calculating, patient in the way Alistair had warned her he would be. The final confrontation arrived at the grand seasonal ball, the most important social event of the year, attended by nearly every noble family within the region, including the king's own representatives. Alara had dressed carefully that evening, aware of the significance of the occasion, and had entered the ballroom on Alistair's arm feeling, for the first time, as though she truly belonged in the world she had been thrust into so unwillingly months before. The evening proceeded smoothly for hours, filled with dancing and cautious pleasantries, until Gareth Ashford appeared near the center of the hall, flanked by several allies Alara did not recognize, his expression carrying a confidence that immediately set her nerves on edge. He raised his voice deliberately, ensuring the surrounding crowd could hear every word. Duke Voss, Gareth announced, his tone carrying false pleasantry sharp enough to cut. I wonder if you might indulge the court with an explanation. Rumors continue to circulate regarding the unusual sum you paid for your current wife, nearly double the original agreement. Some among us wonder what a man truly purchases with such generosity. A hush fell over the surrounding guests, curious eyes turning toward Alistair, who met Gareth's challenge with unwavering calm, though Alara could feel the tension radiating from him beneath his composed exterior. I purchased nothing, Ashford, Alistair said clearly, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent hall. My wife is not property to be measured in coin. The additional payment was made to correct the insulting valuation her family placed upon her, a valuation that reduced a remarkable woman to a mere transaction. I would think a man of your supposed intelligence could understand the difference between purchase and justice, though clearly I overestimate you. Laughter rippled quietly through parts of the crowd, and Gareth's confident expression flickered with visible irritation. He pressed forward regardless, clearly determined to salvage his planned humiliation. And yet the rumors of Isabel persist, do they not? A pattern of women entering your household under mysterious circumstances, only for the truth to remain conveniently obscured. There is no mystery, Alastair replied evenly. Isabel abandoned our engagement for wealthier prospects, a truth she herself confirmed the night you dragged her uninvited onto my estate in a failed attempt at manufactured scandal. I would be careful continuing to invoke her name, Ashford, given how poorly that particular scheme concluded for you. A murmur of surprise spread through the crowd, several guests exchanging pointed glances as the implications of Alastair's words settled over them. Gareth's composure cracked visibly now, color rising in his face, as he realized his carefully planned humiliation was collapsing in front of the very audience he had hoped to impress. You speak boldly for a man hiding secrets of his own, Gareth snapped, abandoning his earlier smoothness entirely. I hide nothing, Alastair replied, stepping forward with quiet authority that immediately commanded the attention of everyone nearby. Unlike you, Ashford, who has spent months attempting to manufacture scandal through blackmail, bribery, and the exploitation of a woman's painful past, all in pursuit of destroying a reputation you could never rival honestly. I believe several members of this court would be very interested to learn the full details of your scheme, including your outstanding debts and the threats you issued against my household under cover of darkness. Gareth's eyes widened slightly, panic flickering behind his anger as he realized the true weight of the exposure Alastair was prepared to deliver publicly, in front of witnesses whose opinions genuinely mattered to his standing at court. You would not dare, he said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. I would, Alastair said simply. In fact, I already have. At his signal, one of the king's representatives stepped forward from the surrounding crowd, a folded document in hand, confirming quietly that formal inquiries into Lord Ashford's conduct had already been initiated following a detailed report submitted by Duke Voss regarding threats, harassment, and attempted extortion. The color drained entirely from Gareth's face, as murmurs of shock and disapproval spread rapidly through the surrounding guests, the very reputation he had spent the evening attempting to destroy now turning decisively against him instead. Without another word, Gareth turned and fled the ballroom, his allies quickly dispersing rather than remain associated with his unraveling scandal. The hall buzzed with astonished conversation in his wake, though Alara barely registered any of it, her attention entirely fixed on Alastair, who turned to her with quiet relief evident behind his composed expression. You planned this, she said softly, once they had stepped away from the immediate crush of curious onlookers. I could not risk him continuing to threaten you, Alastair admitted. I began gathering evidence the night he brought Isabel to our estate. I simply waited for the right moment to use it, one that would protect you as thoroughly as possible. You could have told me, Alara said, though there was no true frustration in her voice, only gratitude wrapped in quiet awe. I did not want you carrying that burden alongside everything else, Alastair said gently. You have carried enough already, Alara. Allow me this one thing, protecting you without needing to be asked. Alara studied him for a long moment, the noise of the ballroom fading into distant background as she took in the full weight of everything he had done, quietly, patiently, without ever demanding recognition for any of it. Whatever fear or uncertainty had once defined her feelings toward this man, it had long since transformed into something far deeper, something she no longer wished to deny, even to herself. Thank you, she said softly, for choosing to fight for me again and again when you never had to. Alastair reached for her hand, his gray eyes steady and warm in a way that had once seemed impossible from the cold, distant man she had first met on the manor steps. "I will always choose to fight for you," he said quietly. "That is not a promise I make lightly, Alara. I intend to keep it for as long as you allow me the privilege." In the weeks following the ball, Gareth Ashford's formal disgrace unfolded exactly as the king's representatives had promised. His land seized to settle the debts he had long concealed. His standing at court, reduced to a cautionary tale, whispered among nobles wary of repeating his mistakes. Alara heard little of the details, uninterested in dwelling further on a man who had caused her so much fear, choosing instead to focus on the quiet, steady life that had begun to take shape around her at the Voss estate. Alistair had changed in ways Alara found herself noticing more each day. The guarded distance that once defined him softening into an openness she suspected few others had ever witnessed. He sought her company deliberately now, no longer confining himself to his study for hours on end, choosing instead to walk with her through the gardens, to sit beside her during quiet evenings by the fire, to share small pieces of himself he had once kept locked away entirely. One crisp autumn morning, Alistair requested she meet him in the private garden behind the manor, a request delivered through Nora with a strange nervousness that immediately caught Alara's attention. She found him standing beneath the same old tree where he had once revealed the truth about Isabel, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carrying a rare vulnerability that made her heart quicken with uncertain anticipation. "You asked to see me," Alara said, approaching slowly. "I did," Alistair replied, turning to face her fully. "There is something I have wanted to say for some time, though I confess I have struggled to find the right words for it." Alara waited, her heart pounding, as he drew a slow breath before continuing. "When you first arrived here," he said, "I told myself this arrangement was simply a matter of correcting an injustice, ensuring your family understood your true worth. I believed foolishly that I could offer you protection and generosity without allowing myself to feel anything deeper than obligation. I was wrong, Alara. I have been wrong since the very first evening, when you looked at me across that endless dinner table and refused to pretend gratitude you did not feel. I admired you instantly, though it took me far longer than it should have to understand what that admiration truly meant." Alara's breath caught, warmth spreading through her chest as she listened, unable to look away from the sincerity written so plainly across his usually composed features. "I know our beginning was not one either of us chose," Alistair continued. "I know you arrived here as a transaction, sold by people who should have valued you far beyond any price they placed upon you. I cannot undo that history, no matter how much I wish I could. But I can offer you a choice now, one that was denied to you before. I am not asking you to remain here out of obligation, or gratitude, or the fear of returning to a family who never deserved you. I am asking you freely, honestly, because I love you, Alara Whitmore, more completely than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone." He reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own, his eyes steady despite the vulnerability trembling just beneath the surface of his voice. "Stay," he said softly. "Not because you were sold to me, not because your family left you no other path, but because you choose to. Stay at court, stay in this life, stay beside me, not as my purchased bride, but as my wife in every true sense of the word, for as long as we both shall live. I am asking you to choose this, Alara, freely and completely, the way you were never allowed to choose anything before." Tears gathered in Alara's eyes, though they carried none of the sorrow that had once defined her arrival at this estate. She thought of the frightened, furious young woman who had climbed those manor steps months before, resigned to a life she believed would be nothing more than cold obligation and quiet suffering. She thought of everything that had unfolded since, the chess games and courtyard confrontations, the quiet protection and fierce loyalty, the slow, careful unraveling of walls neither of them had expected to fall. "I choose this," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion trembling through it. "I choose you, Alistair, not because gold once changed hands between our families, but because somewhere between that first cold dinner and this very moment, I fell in love with the man hidden beneath the reputation everyone warned me to fear. I want to stay, freely, completely, for exactly the reasons you described. Alistair's composed expression finally broke entirely, a genuine, unguarded smile spreading across his face as he pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that erased every cold, distant memory of their first meeting. Alara laughed softly against his shoulder, overwhelmed by the sheer, unexpected joy of a moment she never could have imagined possible on the day her family had traded her away like an object with a price. "Forever, then," he murmured against her hair. "Forever," she agreed, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes, filled now with a warmth that mirrored her own. "At court in this life beside you. Freely chosen, exactly as it should be." The autumn sun broke through the clouds overhead as they stood together beneath the old tree, sealing a promise built not on gold or obligation, but on the quiet, hard-won trust of two people who had learned, against every expectation, to choose each other completely. Spring arrived at the Voss estate with a warmth that seemed to settle into every corner of the manor, chasing away the last shadows of the cold, guarded household Alara had first entered nearly a year before. The wedding, when it finally took place, bore little resemblance to the transaction that had originally brought them together. There was no negotiated sum, no reluctant father counting coins in a dim study, no daughter delivered like cargo to a stranger's door. Instead, there was Alara, standing before a gathered crowd of genuine friends and newly earned allies, choosing with her whole heart the man beside her. Lady Beatrice stood among the witnesses, her earlier kindness having grown into a true friendship that had carried Alara through the more difficult months of court life. Nora wept openly through the ceremony, insisting it was simply dust in her eyes whenever anyone teased her for it. Even a few of the court women who had once whispered cruelly about the bought bride now offered genuine warmth, their earlier judgments long since dissolved by the undeniable devotion evident between the Duke and his wife. News of Gareth Ashford's continued decline reached them only occasionally after that, filtered through distant conversation rather than any direct concern of their own. He had fled the region entirely following the loss of his lands, his ambitions crumbling into obscurity far from the court he had once hoped to dominate through manipulation and threat. Alara found she felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that the shadow he had cast over their early months together had finally lifted for good. Edmund and Margaret Whitmore never returned to the estate after their humiliating dismissal, though word occasionally reached Alara that they had been forced to sell portions of their remaining property to settle debts that had only continued growing in her absence. She felt a distant sadness for the parents who had never truly understood her worth, but she no longer carried guilt over the boundaries Alistair had helped her establish. She had learned, slowly and completely, that love could not be measured in coin, and that the family she had been born into was not the only family capable of offering her belonging. In its place, she found something far more lasting within the walls of the estate she had once feared. Alistair proved, day after day, that the cold reputation surrounding him had only ever been a shield built to protect a heart once wounded by betrayal, a heart he had slowly, carefully allowed her to fully understand. Their marriage settled into a rhythm built on genuine partnership rather than obligation, filled with quiet mornings over chess, long walks through gardens that no longer felt like unfamiliar territory, and evenings spent simply enjoying each other's company without the weight of court judgment pressing down upon them. A year after their wedding, Alara stood once more on the same terrace where Alistair had first confessed the depth of his feelings, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of gold. He joined her quietly, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently against her shoulder as they watched the light fade together. "Do you ever think of that first evening?" she asked softly. "The carriage, the cold dinner, all of it." "Often," Alistair admitted. "Mostly I think of how frightened and furious you looked, and how certain I was that I had never met anyone quite so remarkable in my entire life." Alara laughed softly, leaning back against him. "I thought you were the coldest man I had ever encountered." "And now," he asked, a familiar warmth coloring his voice. "Now," she said, turning in his arms to face him fully, "I know you are simply waiting for someone willing to look past the walls you built to survive your own painful history. I am grateful, every single day, that I was given the chance to be that person." Alistair leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, the same quiet tenderness he had shown her since the earliest days of their unlikely beginning. "As am I," he murmured, "more grateful than I ever believed myself capable of feeling." They stood together as the last light faded into evening, two people who had begun as strangers bound by an unwanted transaction, and who had, through patience, honesty, and hard-won trust, built something neither gold nor circumstance could ever have purchased on its own. What her family had sold for coin, Alistair had transformed into something priceless, a love chosen freely, cherished completely, and destined to last far beyond the fading memory of the price once placed upon it. And in the quiet warmth of that estate, once feared as a cold fortress and now cherished as a true home, Alara understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, that she had never truly been traded at all. She had simply been waiting to find the one place, and the one person worth choosing for herself.